When a flight attendant dismisses a black family and kicks them out of first class, she thinks she's putting them in their place. But when the plane lands, she discovers the shocking truth. They own the airline. What happens next will leave her questioning everything. Before we start the story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. The crisp click of designer heels echoed through Terminal 3 of International Airport as Rebecca Collins strode purposefully toward the crew briefing room. 15 years in the sky had sculpted her into the epitome of sophistication. Every hair perfectly coiffed, her Skylux Airlines uniform pressed to military precision, and a smile that could charm even the most demanding passenger. At 42, Rebecca wore her experience like a badge of honor. Her colleagues often joked that she could spot a first-time flyer from a mile away, just as easily as she could identify a CEO trying to travel incognito. The art of reading people had become second nature, a skill she'd honed through countless flights across the globe. "Good morning, Miss Collins." The junior flight attendants would greet her, their voices tinged with a mixture of admiration and trepidation. Rebecca had earned her reputation as the queen of first-class service at Skylux Airlines, where excellence wasn't just a goal, it was the minimum standard. In the crew room mirror, she adjusted her signature pearl earrings, a gift from her mother when she first earned her wings. The reflection showed more than just her immaculate appearance. It revealed the quiet pride of someone who had climbed the ranks through sheer determination. Her steel blue eyes held the confidence of a woman who knew her worth in an industry where first impressions meant everything. Skylux Airlines wasn't just any carrier. It was the crown jewel of luxury air travel. Their first-class cabins rivaled five-star hotels, and their passenger list read like a who's who of global influence. Rebecca had served royalty, tech billionaires, and Hollywood stars, each interaction adding another layer to her polished expertise. As she reviewed the flight manifest for the day, her perfectly manicured fingers traced down the list of passengers. "Another full house in first class," she murmured to herself, already mentally choreographing the intricate dance of premium service she would orchestrate at 35,000 feet. Little did Rebecca know that today's flight would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. Her values, her prejudices, and the carefully constructed world she had built around her prestigious position at Skylux Airlines. But for now, she stood tall, confident, and utterly certain of her place in the world of luxury air travel. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting a golden glow on her silver wings pin, a symbol of excellence that Rebecca wore with unwavering pride. As she gathered her things for the pre-flight briefing, she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. This was her domain, her expertise, her perfectly ordered world. Or at least, that's what she believed it to be. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Gate A7 as Flight 512 to Paris prepared for boarding. Rebecca positioned herself at the entrance, her practiced eye scanning the gathering crowd of elite travelers. The familiar symphony of pre-flight activities played out before her. The gentle murmur of conversation in multiple languages, the software of tablets and laptops being tucked away, and the subtle rustle of designer luggage being arranged. Skylux Airlines Flight 512 to Paris will now begin priority boarding for our first-class passengers, her colleague announced, the words floating melodiously through the terminal. One by one, the usual parade of luxury began. A renowned fashion editor in her signature oversized sunglasses. A silver-haired CEO clutching his vintage leather briefcase. A celebrated concert pianist with his Hermes scarf draped just so. Rebecca greeted each with the perfect blend of deference and familiarity that had become her trademark. Then they appeared. The Johnson family emerged from the crowd like a gentle ripple in a pool of ostentation. They moved with an understated grace that seemed almost out of place among the flashier first-class passengers. James Johnson, tall and composed, wore a simple charcoal sweater and well-fitted jeans. His wife, Camille, exuded a quiet elegance in her cream turtleneck and tailored trousers. Their two children, a girl of about 12 and a boy perhaps 9, were dressed in neat, comfortable clothing suitable for travel. Something about them caught Rebecca's attention. There was no designer luggage, no obvious displays of wealth, yet they carried themselves with an innate dignity that seemed both natural and mysterious. The children were well-behaved, speaking in soft tones and staying close to their parents, a refreshing change from the entitled offspring Rebecca usually encountered in first class. "Good afternoon," James Johnson said, presenting their boarding passes with a warm smile that reached his eyes. "Flight 512 to Paris?" Rebecca took the documents, her manicured fingers hovering over the first-class designation. She glanced from the passes to the family, then back again. There was a disconnect in her mind, a subtle but persistent notion that something wasn't quite right about this picture. "Yes, of course," she replied, her professional smile firmly in place despite the slight furrow in her brow. "Though I'll need to verify these tickets, if you wouldn't mind stepping aside for a moment." The Johnsons exchanged a brief look, so brief that most would have missed it, but complied without protest. Camille guided their children to the side with a gentle touch, while James maintained his pleasant expression, though something flickered behind his eyes. As Rebecca began her unnecessary verification process, the stream of other first-class passengers continued to flow past. Several cast curious glances at the family waiting patiently to the side, their simple attire standing in stark contrast to the parade of luxury brands and statement pieces surrounding them. Little did Rebecca know that this moment, this small decision based on unconscious assumptions, would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her career, but her entire worldview. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the terminal windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, oblivious to the drama quietly unfolding at Gate A7. The gentle hum of the aircraft's ventilation system did little to quiet the nagging discomfort in Rebecca's mind as she watched the Johnson family make their way down the jet bridge. Their tickets were valid, impeccably so, yet something continued to gnaw at her professional instincts. Years of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle markers of first-class passengers, the confident stride, the designer labels, the casual display of wealth. The Johnsons possessed none of these. "I'll need to check your boarding passes one more time," Rebecca announced as they reached the aircraft door, ignoring the slight furrow of confusion that crossed Camille Johnson's face. After all, this was the third verification she'd requested. The children, Emma and Marcus, stood quietly beside their parents, their eyes taking in the plush interior of the first-class cabin. Rebecca noticed how they didn't immediately reach for the entertainment systems or demand pre-flight refreshments like most privileged children she encountered. "Is there a problem with our tickets?" James Johnson inquired softly, his tone measured, but carrying an undertone that Rebecca chose to ignore. No problem at all," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "However, there seems to be a slight seating arrangement issue." It was a lie, of course. The Johnsons' assigned seats were in the prime section of first class, 2A through 2D, offering maximum privacy and optimal service access. But Rebecca had already made up her mind. "I'll need to relocate you to row 5, she explained, gesturing toward the back of the first-class cabin. "It's closer to the amenities." Row 5 was notoriously less desirable, situated near the restrooms and the galley. The constant foot traffic and noise made it the last choice for seasoned first-class travelers. As she directed them to their new seats, Rebecca felt a flutter of justification. Surely, if they were genuine first-class passengers, they would protest the downgrade. But the Johnsons didn't protest. Instead, they moved with quiet dignity to their reassigned seats, James helping his children stow their modest carry-ons while Camille arranged their personal items with practiced efficiency. Throughout the boarding process, Rebecca caught snippets of whispered conversations from other passengers. Did they get upgraded? Surely there must be some mistake. First class isn't what it used to be. Each murmured comment reinforced her decision, even as a small voice in the back of her mind questioned her actions. She pushed the doubt aside, focusing instead on welcoming other passengers, those whose designer luggage and sophisticated demeanor aligned with her expectations. As she moved through her pre-flight duties, Rebecca couldn't help but notice how the Johnson children maintained their composure, quietly reading books instead of demanding immediate attention. James and Camille spoke in hushed tones, their bearing somehow making row 5 seem as dignified as any other seat in the cabin. The discomfort in Rebecca's chest grew stronger, accompanied by a new sensation, a creeping unease that perhaps she had misjudged something fundamental. But as the final boarding call echoed through the cabin, she straightened her uniform and pushed the feeling aside. After all, she was just maintaining the standards that Skylux Airlines was known for. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the faces of the passengers. In the subtle interplay of light and darkness, Rebecca failed to notice the knowing glances exchanged between James and Camille Johnson, or the way several other passengers observed her actions with growing disapproval. As the engines roared to life, she remained unaware that her carefully constructed world of assumptions was about to be dramatically upended. 3 hours into the transatlantic journey, the first-class cabin hummed with the quiet efficiency of premium service. Crystal glasses clinked softly as vintage champagne flowed freely, and the aroma of expertly prepared cuisine wafted through the air, for most passengers at least. In row 5, the Johnson family sat patiently, their call button untouched despite the conspicuous absence of the attentive service lavished on their fellow travelers. Rebecca had mastered the art of selective visibility, somehow always finding herself occupied when passing their seats. Their water glasses remained unfilled, their menu cards undelivered, their presence almost deliberately overlooked. From seat 3A, Marcus Chun, a distinguished venture capitalist in his tailored Tom Ford suit, observed the subtle dance of discrimination with growing disquiet. His dark eyes narrowed as he watched Rebecca dote on the passengers in designer, while consistently bypassing the Johnsons. When Camille Johnson politely raised her hand to request service, Rebecca managed to become deeply engrossed in adjusting the temperature controls. "Pardon me," Mr. Chen finally called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I couldn't help but notice the family in row 5 hasn't been offered any refreshment since takeoff." Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks as several heads turned in her direction. "I assure you, sir, I'm attending to all passengers in a timely manner," she replied, her professional mask firmly in place despite the tremor in her voice. But there was something about the Johnsons that continued to unsettle her. They maintained their dignified composure, never complaining, never demanding, and somehow their quiet acceptance felt more challenging than any confrontation. James Johnson would merely meet her eyes with a steady gaze when she hurried past, while Camille occupied herself with helping her children with their books and tablets. The children, Emma and Marcus, occasionally whispered questions to their parents. "Mom, when can we have some juice?" Or "Dad, didn't they say there would be movies?" Their parents' hushed responses carried no hint of frustration, only patient understanding that made Rebecca's stomach twist with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. As the flight progressed, the tension became almost palpable. Other passengers began to exchange knowing looks, and Rebecca caught fragments of their disapproving whispers. Absolutely shameful. In first class, of all places, someone should say something. The breaking point came during the main meal service. While other passengers savored their carefully plated gourmet dishes, Rebecca had somehow run out of the premium menu options by the time she reached row 5. The Johnsons accepted the economy class alternatives without complaint, but their dignity in the face of such obvious slight only served to heighten Rebecca's growing discomfort. James Johnson's quiet "thank you" after receiving his meal felt like an indictment. His calm demeanor and unwavering politeness seemed to pierce through her carefully constructed justifications. The children's well-mannered acceptance of their simplified meals made the knot in her stomach tighten further. Mr. Chun from 3A had taken to watching her every move now, his presence a silent rebuke. When he requested to speak with the lead flight attendant, Rebecca felt her carefully maintained world beginning to crack. The Johnsons' quiet resilience was proving more powerful than any angry confrontation could have been. As she retreated to the galley, Rebecca's hands trembled slightly while preparing another round of drinks for the other passengers. The weight of her actions was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, but she clung desperately to her rationalizations. Yet with each passing moment, the Johnsons' composed presence seemed to challenge not just her authority, but the very foundations of her prejudices. The flight still had several hours remaining, but Rebecca was beginning to sense that something fundamental was shifting, not in the cabin around her, but in the carefully constructed worldview she had built over 15 years of service. And that realization was more terrifying than any turbulence she had ever encountered. As Flight 512 began its descent into Paris, the mounting tension finally crystallized in a confrontation. Marcus Chen rose from his seat, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the aisle as he approached Rebecca during her final cabin check. "Ms. Collins," he spoke in measured tones that carried throughout the hushed cabin, "I've spent the last 7 hours observing what can only be described as systematic discrimination against the family in row 5. As a frequent flyer with Skylux and a member of your board of directors, I find this deeply troubling." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Board of directors? She felt the color drain from her face as other passengers turned to watch the exchange, their expressions a mix of vindication and curiosity. I assure you, sir, there must be some misunderstanding," she stammered, her usual poise crumbling under the weight of his steady gaze. "Is there? Then perhaps you can explain why their call button was ignored 6 times? Or why they received their meals last, with limited options? Or why their children weren't offered the premium amenity kits provided to every other first-class passenger?" Before Rebecca could formulate a response, the aircraft touched down with a gentle thud. As passengers began gathering their belongings, the cabin intercom crackled to life. "Miss Collins, please report to the cockpit immediately upon arrival." The walk to the cockpit felt like the longest of her career. Each step echoed with the weight of her actions, each breath heavy with mounting dread. When she arrived, she found not only the captain, but also Thomas Wagner, the chief of cabin services, waiting for her. "Rebecca," Wagner began, his expression grave, "would you care to explain why Mr. James Johnson, the majority stakeholder of Skylux Airlines, and his family were subjected to substandard service in first class today?" The revelation hit her like a thunderbolt. James Johnson, the unassuming man in the simple sweater, was the very person who owned the majority of the airline she had served so proudly for 15 years. The same man she had relegated to seats by the restroom, whose children she had denied proper service, whose very presence she had deemed unworthy of first class. "Mr. Johnson and his wife Camille," Wagner continued, his voice cutting through her shocked silence, "have been instrumental in transforming Skylux into the premium airline it is today. Their philosophy has always been that true luxury isn't about designer labels or outward appearances. It's about treating every person with dignity and respect." Rebecca's carefully constructed world of assumptions and prejudices came crashing down around her. She remembered how the Johnsons had maintained their dignity throughout the flight, how their quiet grace had made her discomfort grow with each passing hour. Through the cockpit window, she could see the Johnson family being escorted to a waiting VIP vehicle, their simple elegance now taking on a completely different meaning. James Johnson glanced back at the aircraft, and for a moment, their eyes met through the glass. His expression held no anger, no triumph, only a sad understanding that made Rebecca's shame burn even deeper. "They've requested to meet with you," Wagner informed her, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "They'll be waiting in the VIP lounge." "And Rebecca?" He paused, ensuring he had her full attention. "This meeting will determine more than just your future with Skylux. It might teach you something about the true meaning of class." As she watched the Johnson family disappear into their vehicle, Rebecca realized that her greatest professional failure had nothing to do with service protocols or luxury standards. Instead, it lay in the basic human dignity she had denied a family based solely on her own prejudices. The irony was bitter. In trying to maintain what she thought were the airline standards, she had violated its most fundamental principles. The Paris morning sun streamed through the cockpit windows, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the truth she had been too blind to see, that real class had nothing to do with designer labels or expensive accessories. It had been right there in row 5 all along, dressed in a simple sweater and carrying itself with quiet dignity. The VIP lounge at Charles de Gaulle Airport felt more like a courtroom to Rebecca as she stood before its frosted glass doors. Her reflection stared back at her. The pristine uniform that had once been her armor now feeling like a costume of pretense. With trembling fingers, she pressed her access card against the reader. Inside, the Johnsons sat in a quiet corner, their children absorbed in books nearby. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows cast a gentle glow around them, highlighting the natural elegance that Rebecca had so willfully ignored. James Johnson looked up from his conversation with Camille, gesturing to an empty chair across from them. "Please, Ms. Collins, join us," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth it had held during boarding, a fact that only intensified Rebecca's shame. As she sank into the plush leather chair, Rebecca noticed details she had overlooked before. The quiet confidence in Camille's posture, the well-worn wedding ring on James's finger that spoke of commitment rather than ostentation, the way their children occasionally glanced up with concerned expressions for their parents rather than the entitled looks she had expected. Rebecca began, but James raised his hand gently. "Before you speak," he said, "I'd like to share something with you." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding a mixture of disappointment and compassion. 25 years ago, I was a janitor at this very airport. Every night, I would clean these lounges while wealthy passengers walked past me as if I were invisible. Camille reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. "And I was a waitress at the airport cafe," she added. "We met during his breaks, sharing dreams over cups of coffee that we could barely afford." Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes as the full weight of her prejudices crashed down upon her. "When we built Skylux Airlines," James continued, "we had one fundamental principle, that every person, regardless of their appearance or background, deserves to be treated with dignity. The same dignity that we weren't always afforded on our journey here. Today on that flight," Camille spoke softly but firmly, "you made our children feel something we had hoped they would never have to experience, the sting of being judged by appearances rather than character." Emma and Marcus looked up briefly from their books, their young faces showing no anger, only a quiet understanding that broke Rebecca's heart. "But we're not here to punish you, Ms. Collins," James said, noting Rebecca's distress. "We're here because we believe in teachable moments. Your actions today weren't just about poor service. They were about the invisible barriers we create in society, the snap judgments that divide us, the prejudices that we sometimes don't even recognize in ourselves." Camille leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "True luxury, Ms. Collins, isn't about what you wear or how much money you have. It's about how you treat others. It's about recognizing the inherent worth in every human being who crosses your path." "The irony," James added with a slight smile, "is that while you were so focused on external markers of wealth, you missed the very essence of what makes our airline special, its commitment to treating everyone with equal respect and dignity." Rebecca found her voice at last, though it quivered with emotion. I don't know how to begin to apologize. My behavior was inexcusable." "You're right, it was inexcusable," Camille agreed. "But what matters now is what you learn from this, and more importantly, what you do with that learning." James nodded. "We've all been guilty of prejudice at some point, Ms. Collins. The question is, are we willing to acknowledge it, learn from it, and work to change it?" The morning sun had climbed higher now, its rays catching the simple wedding bands on the Johnsons' fingers, symbols of their journey together, from airport janitor and waitress to airline owners, yet never losing sight of their humanity or forgetting where they came from. As Rebecca sat there, absorbing their words and fighting back tears, she realized she was receiving something far more valuable than a reprimand. She was being offered a chance to learn, to grow, to become better, not just as a flight attendant, but as a human being. The lesson being taught in that quiet corner of the VIP lounge wasn't just about airline service or professional conduct. It was about the fundamental dignity of human beings, the danger of assumptions, and the transformative power of treating every person with respect, regardless of their appearance or apparent status in life. The official notice arrived in Rebecca's email the following morning as she sat in her Paris hotel room, the city of light outside her window, a stark contrast to the darkness she felt within. The subject line was clinical. Notice of immediate suspension, pending review. Her hands shook as she opened the message, though she had been expecting it since yesterday's meeting with the Johnsons. Dear Ms. Collins, following the events of Flight 512 and subsequent investigation, you are hereby suspended from duty effective immediately, pending a comprehensive review of your conduct. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes. 15 years of pristine service records, countless commendation letters, and perfect performance evaluations, all now overshadowed by 6 hours of unconscionable behavior. Rebecca moved to her hotel room's window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Below, Parisian families strolled along the boulevard, people of all backgrounds, styles, and appearances mixing naturally in the morning bustle. How many times had she judged strangers based on their outward appearance? How many others had she subtly discriminated against during her career, perhaps without even realizing it? The memory of Emma Johnson's face flashed in her mind, the young girl's quiet dignity as she accepted the economy class meal, the slight droop of her shoulders when she realized she wouldn't receive the premium amenity kit that every other first-class child had been given. Rebecca's chest tightened with shame. She had taught that child a lesson about the world that no child should have to learn. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues. Did you really not know who they were? I can't believe you did that to the Johnsons. What were you thinking, Rebecca? But the truth was more painful than any of their messages suggested. Whether the Johnsons had been the airline's owners or actual economy passengers who had saved for a first-class splurge, her behavior would have been equally wrong. Moving to the bathroom, Rebecca caught her reflection in the mirror. Her uniform hung in the closet behind her, the uniform she had worn with such pride, now a symbol of her failure. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Where was the professional who had prided herself on exemplary service? Had she always been this person and just never noticed? The weight of her actions crashed over her in waves. The deliberate delays in service, the subtle looks of disdain, the unnecessary seat reassignment, the denied amenities, the ignored call buttons, the quiet humiliation she had inflicted on an entire family. She sank onto the edge of the bathtub, her body shaking with silent sobs. The carefully constructed image she had of herself, the consummate professional, the expert in luxury service, crumbled away, revealing something far uglier underneath. Her sister Leah had tried to talk to her about unconscious bias before, but Rebecca had always dismissed it with a wave of her hand. I treat everyone equally, she would say. I don't see color or class. But now those words rang hollow, exposed as the self-deceptive lies they were. The suspension notice had mentioned mandatory sensitivity training and diversity workshops, but Rebecca knew that official programs alone wouldn't be enough. This required something deeper, a fundamental reconstruction of her worldview, a painful examination of her prejudices, and most importantly, a genuine commitment to change. As evening fell over Paris, Rebecca sat at the hotel room's desk and began to write in her journal, forcing herself to document every moment of that flight, every assumption she had made, every act of discrimination she had committed. The words were difficult to write, each one an admission of guilt, but she knew this uncomfortable self-examination was just the beginning of a much longer journey. The city of light continued to sparkle outside her window, but Rebecca barely noticed. She was too busy confronting the darkness within herself, understanding that true change would require more than just regret. It would demand honest self-reflection, genuine remorse, and most importantly, a commitment to becoming someone better than she had been yesterday. The suspension notice lay open on her tablet, but the real punishment wasn't the temporary loss of her position. It was the weight of knowing who she had revealed herself to be, and the long road ahead to becoming the person she should have been all along. The autumn leaves scattered across Rebecca's front yard as she sat on her porch swing, a cup of untouched tea growing cold beside her. 3 weeks into her suspension, the quiet had become both her punishment and her teacher. Without the constant bustle of flight schedules and passenger demands, she was left alone with the one person she needed to confront most, herself. Her phone lit up with a familiar name, Leah, her younger sister, always the family's conscience, had been trying to reach her for days. This time, Rebecca didn't let it go to voicemail. "I messed up, Leah," she whispered into the phone, her voice cracking. "I messed up so badly." "I know, Becca." Leah's voice was warm, free of judgment. "But you're ready to talk about it now, and that's what matters." As a diversity and inclusion consultant, Leah had spent years trying to engage Rebecca in conversations about unconscious bias. Rebecca had always dismissed these attempts with practiced deflection. "I work in luxury service, Leah. It's different there." Now those words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "Can you come over?" Rebecca asked, vulnerability seeping into her voice. "I think I'm finally ready to listen." Hours later, the sisters sat cross-legged on Rebecca's living room floor, surrounded by books, articles, and Leah's workshop materials. A notepad lay between them, filled with Rebecca's handwriting. "My assumptions. Wealth looks a certain way. First-class passengers must display their status. Simple appearance equals less worth. My judgment matters more than human dignity." "The hardest part," Leah explained gently, "is recognizing that these biases exist in all of us. The question is, what do we do once we see them?" Rebecca picked up one of the books Leah had brought, Understanding Unconscious Bias in the Service Industry. Its pages were already dotted with post-it notes and highlighted passages. "I've enrolled in 3 online courses," she said, "but sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in shame." "Shame without action is useless," Leah replied, squeezing her sister's hand. "But shame that motivates change? That's powerful." Over the next few weeks, Rebecca immersed herself in learning. Her dining room became a makeshift classroom. Mornings were spent in online diversity training sessions. Afternoons were dedicated to reading and reflection. Evenings involved deep discussions with Leah about privilege, prejudice, and power. She started keeping a detailed journal, documenting not just her learning, but her emotional journey. Day 15. Realize today how often I've judged passengers based on their appearance. How many wonderful people have I dismissed? How many connections have I missed? Day 23. The course on microaggressions was brutal. Recognized so many of my own behaviors. The weight of past actions is heavy, but the responsibility to change is heavier. Day 31. Leah introduced me to her diversity workshop group. Hearing others' experiences of discrimination, their pain, their resilience. I cried through most of it. One evening, as they shared tea after another intensive session, Leah noticed a shift in her sister's demeanor. "You know what's strange?" Rebecca mused, turning her cup thoughtfully. "I always thought being professional meant maintaining certain standards. Now I realize true professionalism is about maintaining human dignity, everyone's dignity." "That's growth," Leah smiled. "And it's just the beginning." Rebecca nodded, glancing at the wall where she'd pinned a quote from one of her courses. "The journey of self-discovery begins when we stop defending who we were and start embracing who we could be." The autumn was turning to winter, and while her suspension continued, Rebecca felt something new growing within her. Not just remorse for past actions, but a genuine desire to understand, to learn, to change. Each book, each course, each conversation with Leah was another step on a path she should have taken years ago. Her uniform still hung in the closet, untouched, but Rebecca was beginning to understand that her true transformation had nothing to do with what she wore or how she looked. It was about who she was becoming on the inside. Someone who could finally see past the surface to recognize the inherent worth in every person she met. As evening settled over her quiet house, Rebecca opened her laptop to begin another online module. The screen reflected her face, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't look away in shame. Instead, she saw someone in the process of becoming better. Not perfect, but learning, growing, and finally facing the truth about herself and the world around her. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Rebecca arranged chairs in a circle for her first volunteer session at Workplace Equality Now, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting discrimination in professional environments. The irony wasn't lost on her. 2 months ago, she had been the very type of person this organization worked to reform. Are you sure you're ready for this? Maria Rodriguez, the program director, asked gently. Sharing your story isn't easy, especially when you're the one who made the mistakes. Rebecca smoothed her simple blazer, no airline uniform today, and nodded. I need to do this, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been on the receiving end of prejudice like I showed that day. The room slowly filled with human resource managers, service industry workers, and corporate trainers. Each face held a different story, a different perspective, but all were united in their desire to create more equitable workplaces. Rebecca's heart pounded as Maria introduced her. Today, we have someone with a unique perspective. Not a victim of workplace discrimination, but someone who confronted her own biases and chose to change. Taking a deep breath, Rebecca stood. My name is Rebecca Collins, and 2 months ago, I discriminated against the owners of my own airline because they didn't fit my preconceived notion of what wealthy people should look like. The room fell silent. Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger. I was the perfect employee on paper. 15 years of exemplary service, countless commendations. But in one flight, I revealed the ugly truth about my own prejudices. Today, I want to share that story not to absolve myself, but to show how deeply unconscious bias can run, even in those who think they're above it. As she recounted the events of Flight 512, she watched understanding dawn on faces around the room. Some nodded in recognition of their own hidden biases. Others wiped away tears as they connected with the story's implications. Her volunteer work expanded beyond just sharing her story. Rebecca threw herself into the organization's initiatives, helping develop training materials for service industry professionals, mentoring younger employees about recognizing and addressing bias, participating in panel discussions about workplace discrimination, creating guidelines for inclusive customer service practices. One particularly memorable workshop brought her face-to-face with a group of luxury hotel staff. A young concierge raised his hand after her presentation. But how do we maintain standards while ensuring we're not discriminating? He asked, echoing Rebecca's own former concerns. Standards, Rebecca replied, her voice firm but kind, should be about the quality of service you provide, not about who you decide deserves that service. True luxury isn't about catering to wealth. It's about treating everyone with equal dignity. Her story began to spread through professional networks. What started as local workshops expanded to industry conferences and corporate training sessions. Rebecca found herself speaking to audiences of hundreds, sharing not just her mistake, but the difficult journey of confronting her own biases. During one keynote speech at a hospitality industry conference, she unveiled a personal project, a documentary series featuring service industry workers sharing their experiences with discrimination. The project, titled Beyond Appearances, brought together voices from all levels of the service sector, creating a powerful testament to the need for change. Change isn't just about policies and procedures, she told the audience. It's about transforming hearts and minds, starting with our own. Every time we make a snap judgment based on appearance, every time we offer different levels of service based on our assumptions, we're perpetuating a cycle of discrimination that diminishes us all. The work was emotionally demanding. Some days, sharing her story felt like reopening a wound. But each time someone approached her after a session, sharing their own realizations or commitments to change, she knew it was worth it. One evening, after a particularly intense workshop, Maria found Rebecca sitting alone in the community center's office. You've helped transform our program, Maria said, sitting beside her. Your story resonates because it's not about pointing fingers. It's about taking responsibility and choosing to be better. Rebecca smiled, thinking of how far she'd come from that day in Paris. You know what I've learned? Change isn't a destination. It's a daily choice to see people, really see them, for who they are, not what they wear or how they look. As she gathered her materials to leave, Rebecca passed the center's mission statement mounted on the wall, creating workplaces where everyone is valued, respected, and treated with dignity. The words no longer felt like an abstract ideal, but a living commitment she carried in her heart. Outside, the evening sky was painted in soft purples and oranges. Rebecca thought about all the workshops and speeches still ahead of her, all the minds yet to be changed, all the biases yet to be confronted. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time since that fateful flight, she felt truly worthy of the wings she had worn for so many years. Not because of her perfect service record, but because of her commitment to serving everyone with equal dignity and respect. The cursor blinked steadily on Rebecca's laptop screen as she sat in her home office, surrounded by the warm glow of evening light. After 6 months of intense self-reflection and growth, she was finally ready to write the most important letter of her life. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I've written this letter 100 times in my head, but words seem inadequate to express the profound impact you've had on my life. That day on Flight 512, you didn't just expose my prejudices. You offered me a mirror to see myself clearly for the first time. Your response to my discriminatory behavior wasn't just a lesson in dignity. It was a masterclass in grace. You could have demanded my immediate termination, but instead, you chose to make this a moment of education rather than punishment. In the months since our encounter, I've embarked on a journey that has transformed not just my professional perspective, but my entire worldview. Your story, from airport janitor and waitress to airline owners, has become a powerful reminder that character and worth have nothing to do with external appearances. To Emma and Marcus, I owe you a special apology. No child should ever experience discrimination, and I am deeply sorry for the pain my actions may have caused. Your dignity in the face of unfair treatment speaks volumes about the values your parents have instilled in you. As Rebecca typed, tears rolled down her cheeks, but these were different from the tears of shame she'd shed months ago. These were tears of gratitude, of growth, of hope. The letter continued. What you may not know is how your experience has created ripples of change. Through my work with Workplace Equality Now, I've had the privilege of sharing our story with thousands of service industry professionals. Your experience has become a catalyst for change in corporate training programs across the country. I found my true calling as an advocate for equity and inclusion. The airline industry taught me about service, but you taught me about humanity. Every workshop I lead, every speech I give, carries the lesson you imparted that day. That true class has nothing to do with wealth or status, but everything to do with how we treat others. Rebecca paused, considering her next words carefully. I don't ask for forgiveness. What I did was inexcusable. Instead, I want you to know that your response to my discrimination has sparked a movement of change. Your investment in Skylux Airlines isn't just financial. It's a powerful statement about the values that should guide all business interactions. With deepest gratitude and respect, Rebecca Collins. As she hit send, Rebecca felt a sense of completion, though she knew her journey was far from over. Her new career as a diversity and inclusion consultant had taken off beyond her wildest expectations. Companies across the globe were requesting her workshops, drawn by the authenticity of someone who had lived both sides of the story. Her office walls, once adorned with airline service awards, now displayed different achievements. Champion of Change Award from the National Diversity Council. Recognition for her Beyond Appearances documentary series. Letters from service industry workers whose lives she'd touched. Photos from international speaking engagements. But her most prized possession was a simple frame containing the quote that had become her life's mission. True service sees the humanity in everyone. Later that evening, as Rebecca prepared for the next day's workshop, her phone chimed with an email notification. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the sender, James Johnson. The response was brief, but powerful. Dear Rebecca, thank you for your letter. Camille and I always believe that the measure of a person isn't in never making mistakes, but in how they choose to learn and grow from them. You've taken a moment of prejudice and transformed it into a movement for change. That's the kind of leadership our industry and our world needs. The children ask about you sometimes. Perhaps one day, you'll join us for dinner and show them how one person's journey of growth can inspire others to change. Keep spreading the message. Warmly, James. Rebecca sat back in her chair, letting the words wash over her. The journey from that fateful flight to this moment hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. She had lost her wings, but found her voice. She had surrendered her uniform, but discovered her purpose. As night fell over her quiet neighborhood, Rebecca opened her workshop materials for the next day. Tomorrow, she would stand before another group of professionals, sharing her story not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the possibility of change. In her heart, she knew that every person she reached, every mind she opened, every perspective she shifted, was another step toward the world the Johnsons had envisioned. A world where dignity and respect weren't earned by appearance or status, but freely given as a fundamental human right. The journey of self-discovery and growth hadn't ended. It had evolved into a mission to help others begin their own journeys. And in this mission, Rebecca had found something far more valuable than her former career. She had found purpose, redemption, and the profound satisfaction of contributing to positive change in the world. The grand ballroom of the International Conference Center hummed with anticipation as over 2,000 industry professionals settled into their seats. The annual Global Service Excellence Summit had chosen an unprecedented theme this year: Beyond Appearances, Transforming Service Through Inclusion. Rebecca stood backstage, adjusting her simple but elegant blazer. Gone were the days when she measured her worth by designer labels or external validation. The conference program listed her as the keynote speaker, Rebecca Collins, From Prejudice to Purpose, a journey of transformation. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage as the lights dimmed. The spotlight found her, and for a moment, she was transported back to that fateful flight. But this time, she wasn't hiding behind a mask of false superiority. She was standing in her truth. 3 years ago, she began, her voice clear and confident, I was the perfect flight attendant on paper. Today, I stand before you as something far more important, a changed human being. The audience leaned forward as she continued. We often talk about luxury service as if it's about recognizing wealth. But true luxury, true excellence, is about recognizing humanity. It took discriminating against the owners of my own airline for me to learn that lesson. As she shared her story, Rebecca noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Maria from Workplace Equality now sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Her sister Leah was there too, recording the speech for their training programs. And in the middle of the audience, she spotted them, the Johnson family, who had come without announcing their presence. Change, she continued, her voice growing stronger, isn't just about policies or procedures. It's about the daily choice to challenge our assumptions, to question our biases, to see beyond the surface. She shared stories from her workshops, testimonials from service professionals who had transformed their approaches, and data showing how inclusive service practices had improved customer satisfaction across industries. But the most powerful change, she said, her eyes meeting James Johnson's supportive gaze, happens within ourselves. When we stop defending who we were and start embracing who we could be. The presentation screens behind her displayed images from her journey. Her first volunteer workshop at the community center, international training sessions she conducted, the launch of her Beyond Appearances documentary, corporate programs she'd helped transform. Today, I don't just teach about inclusion, I live it. Every person I meet is an opportunity to practice what I preach, to see the humanity behind the appearance, to offer dignity without qualification. As she concluded her speech, Rebecca shared her vision for the future. Imagine a world where service excellence means treating everyone with equal respect, where our unconscious biases don't determine the quality of care we provide, where true luxury is measured not by the price tag, but by the dignity we afford to every human being. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her speech. It was a recognition of the universal truth she'd come to embody. As people lined up afterward to share their own stories and commitments to change, Rebecca felt a deep sense of purpose. Later that evening, at a small gathering with close colleagues and the Johnsons, Emma, now a teenager, approached her. You know, Emma said thoughtfully, that day on the plane, I felt so small. But watching you today, sharing your story to help others, it made me feel like something good came from it. Rebecca hugged the young girl, remembering the quiet dignity she'd shown that day. You and your family taught me that true class isn't about how we look or what we own. It's about how we treat others, especially when no one knows who we are. As she looked around the room at the faces of those who had supported her journey, Leah, Maria, the Johnsons, and countless others, Rebecca felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her future stretched before her, not as a finished path, but as an ongoing journey of growth and learning. The next morning, as she prepared for another workshop, Rebecca opened her journal to write. The journey never really ends. Each day brings new opportunities to challenge our assumptions, to grow beyond our prejudices, to see the humanity in every person we meet. My greatest achievement isn't in becoming perfect. It's in remaining committed to becoming better. Tomorrow brings new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities for growth. And I'm ready for all of it. The sun rose over the city, casting long shadows that reminded her of that morning in Paris when everything had changed. But now, instead of shame, she felt hope. Hope for herself, for the industry she loved, and for a future where dignity and respect would be the true markers of luxury service. Rebecca Collins, once the perfect flight attendant, had become something far more valuable, a testament to the possibility of change and a beacon of hope for others beginning their own journeys of transformation.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.